Welcome to Spectrum Sundays. I am Francesca D'Alessandro, a current master's student at University of Buffalo studying speech-language pathology. Additionally, I am your Miss Thousand Islands of New York State, serving my community through AAA Appreciation and Awareness for Autism.
And I am Megan Sinisi, a Master of Health Science candidate studying to practice as a pediatric speech-language pathologist. I am also Miss Central Pennsylvania and the founder of a nonprofit organization for autism titled From a New Perspective.
Everyone deserves to feel accepted and included in every space they walk in. Our series aims to inspire you to advocate for yourself and on behalf of your loved ones. And we are so grateful that you're here with us today. Kayla Monville is a mother of two beautiful and perfect children with autism. She received her master's degree in special education from Saginaw Valley State University and has been an educator for 10 years in both general education and special education classrooms. She is currently teaching education fundamentals to future educators at a career and technical school. The love for her children and her diverse educational background has driven Kayla to provide a book that can relate to a broad range of families. Kayla hopes families, educators, and professionals working with young children can use her book titled Rock With Me as a learning tool to promote acceptance and autism awareness, as well as celebrate the very things we love so much about our children and students. So thank you again for being with us today, Kayla.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
We love having you on. And we talked a lot about different things and different topics within the autism community last time, but we really want to promote a message of acceptance and inclusion on our series. And we noticed that over the past few years, the community has shifted from an awareness perspective to more of that acceptance perspective. So could you share more about what acceptance and inclusion means to you as a mother of two children with autism and how you hope it looks like for your children in years to come?
Yeah, so with acceptance comes awareness. They need to have some sort of awareness about it before they can truly accept it. You can't accept something you don't know anything about. But with my own children, the biggest, and I think this is every parent's fear, but the biggest fear I have of mine is when I'm sending my child to school, what that looks like. I can't be there. I don't know a lot about what happens in their day, that because that communication is not there. And I want my child to be liked and accepted for who they are, because I find them so beautiful and so loving that I can't imagine somebody not liking them. But there are certain qualities and differences that could make my children stand out. So when I'm sending them off to school, giving them some tools to make their teachers aware, their peers aware, so that they can accept them. Otherwise, if they my child does something or has like a sensory meltdown or the routine's off and that really upsets them, and they could stand out in a certain way that can be negative and have a negative social impact on them, and giving them that tools to say, even just I'm sorry, or I need, a visual schedule, or giving them the advocacy tools so that they can support themselves and make friends and build those connections. And then therefore others can accept who they are and help them in understanding, oh, the schedule is going to be off. Maybe we should, prepare, them in this certain way and have that peer-to-peer relationship. So they have to have some sense of awareness of what they need first to be able to accept that and then be able to support that in their life. But like I said, I think every parent struggles with, like, I want them to be liked. I want them to make friends. I want them to have friendships. And that's important, for us too, as parents.
Yes, and you're absolutely right that we have to continue to educate people about what autism is and what it looks like, and maybe even more so to young children, because if children and students don't have exposures to people who are different from them, or they just come from a family who has never experienced disability as a part of their life, then yeah, when they go to school, they're going to ask questions when something looks different, and they might start to formulate their own opinions. So until you have that conversation with teachers and students, then it's going to be a surprise to them when they see it for the first time. And I think that's only human. But if we prepare ourselves for that moment and we continue to advocate for our children and our students so that they can be exposed to different people with different backgrounds and neurotypical or neurodiverse the same, the more inclusion that there is, the better that we can accomplish that for the children and the students that we serve.
Yeah, absolutely. You said it perfectly. And that's it. And at a young age,
Mhm.
getting them together because they shouldn't be exposed to each other in kindergarten and first grade. It should be so much younger.
Yes. So I'm sure throughout your professional and your personal experience, you have learned a ton of different lessons from both being a parent and a teacher of children with disabilities. So, what is maybe one of the biggest lessons that you have learned from your students and children?
It's just their ability to capitalize on that and that their strengths. We talked about in our last segment about this, and it's just so true. There's certain characteristics or qualities that we want to improve on that is their deficits or their weaknesses, but doing so we still need to build off of their strengths while doing that. If we're just focusing on what they can't do, we're missing all of the things that they are able to do or their ability to do. So being able to just capitalize on that.
Right. And going back to just about being in a classroom and being in a general education classroom specifically, I had started in a special education classroom. So a lot of those accommodations and the supports that the children needed were already there, but those
Mhm.
supports and accommodations might not be readily available in a general education setting. So what are some ways that general education teachers or aides could really make their classroom more inclusive and welcoming to students who might be on the spectrum?
Yeah, and I talk about this a lot with my future educators, and that is what you're doing for those students in special education, what their IEP says that they might need to be successful. Can you do that with all students? If they're saying provide a visual, well, and that would be helpful for that student. Would a visual be helpful for all students? So you don't need to specifically single them out to make that accommodation. Those accommodations could be helpful for all students. So understanding that the IEP is there and you need to follow the IEP. These are things in the IEP that are going to support and help that child be successful. And you can do that with all of your students so that they're all being successful and then they're helping each other. And what a great thing that is. So if it's certain things, like I said, visuals was just one, accommodations, or it was frequent breaks, or it's giving students additional time to do something. If the additional time is not something that is being measured, then if you can give that to all students, then why not? But even just specifically asking students what they need to be successful and getting students to take ownership of their own learning and find out, what do I need that's going to then help me be a better student? And then providing that for all of your students. So then you're not just singling them out, you have an inclusive student centered classroom.
Yes. And I feel that as a perhaps for general education teachers, they might see an IEP as an obstacle or something extra to do. But
Mhm.
the way that you said it, we even had a self advocate who expressed this idea as well. These accommodations can be beneficial for so many more than just the individual with a disability. So it might appear to be one extra step, but once you take that step and make that accommodation, it really can be very fruitful for the entire classroom. So I feel like whenever you break down an IEP, it's a long document. So it can look cumbersome and overwhelming, but whenever you do talk about those examples for extra time, I think I heard not too long ago that psychologists say that you really are only beneficial in focusing on one task for 20 minutes at a time.
20 minutes. Yeah.
So, and that's not specific to children with disabilities or people with
Mm-mm.
disabilities. So, people can benefit from these things. And IEPs are there as a legal binding document so that these children can get the supports that they need. But that doesn't mean that it cannot also benefit the other students. So I feel like you really spoke to that point as well. So going outside of the education realm and back into your personal life, you share a lot of intimate moments of your family on social media and your children's experiences in everyday life. And this kind of perspective can really inspire other parents to authentically embrace the dynamics of their families, no matter
Mhm.
how different it looks from the conventional family. So, how do you find a balance of providing an unfiltered view of your children's experiences in a way that promotes awareness and acceptance while not exploiting or oversharing their struggles?
Yeah, and that's really difficult because I always question, like, when I go to make a post, and I'm not one that's posting a lot, but I do want to share our journey and our experiences and hope to help others. But there's certain things that I don't post just for privacy of my own children. My son is going to be, a talking adult someday, and I hope my daughter too. We just pray we hear her voice. But would he want that out there? Would he want that being said or shown? He doesn't have the say right now because he's 7 and I do, but I want to respect his, future wishes and privacy, that he doesn't look back and see that maybe we exposed his whole life and that it was shined on in a negative way, or a way that was not authentic, because we have so many great moments in our life and we are doing such great things with our children, but we have hard times too. And being able to identify those and be able to be a real and connect with parents, because if our life just looked like I was just doing everything right and everything is so perfect because I have a special ed background, so my kids are just perfect, that's not real. That's not how it is. They're still children and they still have needs. And I'm still a human and I'm still a parent that is figuring it out too, because I can have all the knowledge in the world, but doesn't mean that I have it all figured out every single day, because with autism, it changes all the time. So once you think you have it figured out, the next minute, it's, completely different. So it's a tough one. I try to pick what I think parents can identify with or professionals can identify with. And I do have some moments of, if this is heavy on my heart and this is something I'm feeling right now, and I can connect or help somebody in a way, I want to do so. But I want it to be not a venting session, but more of like a lesson learned, so that maybe the real situations, for instance, like if I had judged another situation, or that maybe my kids had gone through, and then at the end of the lesson, I realized like that was wrong of me. It's human to judge. It's human to think those things, but to be identifiable, I guess, and say that I don't have it all figured out either. And we're learning as we go, and we're just doing the best we can. And others can relate to that as well.
Yeah, I think especially too in the last few years, as we are trying to recover from the pandemic and how it's changed our everyday life and our routines, I think more than ever, especially in the professional workplace, we're recognizing that all we can do is the best that we can, and not every day is going to go perfectly or seamlessly, and we have a million different plans that we make, and then we usually have to switch our plans. But as long as you are authentic to yourself and recognizing it as a learning moment, that's just the best that we can do. And hopefully it helps when you share those stories for other people to learn from as well. But speaking on the routines that we've had to reconstruct and remake for ourselves during our time at home, or just adapting to virtual life, how has your family and yourself um, managed working through the curveballs that have been faced?
Some days we're killing it. Some days it's killing us, I feel like. But it's just kind of how, especially when we first shut down last year in March, I was like, what are we going to do? I have 2 children at home. I am going to be responsible for their education while I'm teaching all day. So what does that look like? So thankfully we have such a great support system. And, my mom is their caretaker when I'm at school, and she, runs into all their therapies, and she's there every day for us. So she really had to step in. We had to do some computer lessons of, this is how we get on a Google Meet and this is what it looks like, and really just work together. But it was a curveball for us because, that routines change. I saw so many memes, like when the autism like pages that said like, how does it feel? Like you're changing the routines like that. It's not so fun, is it? And it's so true. Like those parents and those people with autism can totally relate because, their whole world just got turned upside down. So it was just like, it took us a minute to figure it out. But once we did, and we just established a different routine, and then we all settled into this different routine. And then when the routine changed again, being able to front load that a little bit more with my children and letting them know, okay, it's going to change again. And this is what it's going to look like. And it gave us a lot of good practice because in real life, things do change like that. You may go to the store for a certain kind of milk, and they don't have it, and we have to adjust. So it gave us some unexpected good practice on routine change. And my children struggle both with OCD. So having things exactly the same way and the same routine. Luckily, we've been working with occupational therapists for a few years now on these changes in routine and being able to make adjustments and accommodations. So we're just taking all those strategies and applying them into our home.
You are so optimistic. I love to hear you speak about your different experiences. And it's a breath of fresh air because, understandably, it can become very frustrating. And I am not a parent, but I can only imagine how hard it would be to literally raise a little human to begin with. So I can't imagine. I'm 25 and I can't imagine. So someday I hope to have that beautiful family, but it's hard, and it's good to hear an optimistic view from a parent. And you're so right that we try so hard to prepare our students how to adjust to daily life that are, they're not always going to have the right brand of milk at school. They might switch. They might have a shortage of the particular pencil that you like to use.
Mhm.
And I feel like it would be very easy for families to want to protect their children and avoid those situations from happening at all so that their child doesn't have to experience something very traumatizing to them. But the more that we protect our children and our students, the less that they have those exposures to differences in their routine and the practice to adapt. Now, of course, you shouldn't just throw your child out there all the time, to practice that, but little bits at a time. And I definitely think that this last year has given an opportunity, as unfortunate as it has been, but I'm glad to hear that it has been overall a positive experience for you.
Yeah. Yeah, and we got some time at home that we never would have received. My husband travels for work, and we have had him home for a year, and it's been amazing just to have him home all the time for a year. And my kids, he's their biggest fan, and my husband hung the moon and the stars, so they just are loving having him home. So I'm hoping too, we've learned to adapt to these changes and that we can accomplish things differently, and it doesn't have to look like we've always done it, and that is still meeting the same goal, and that maybe my husband won't travel as much because we can do these things like we're doing right now, like all this virtual stuff that we didn't even access before. And that when my children miss a day from school, we still have access to education through this. So there has been a lot of positives come out of it. And that time at home, it all starts at the family. It starts at the home. So giving us that opportunity just to be all together and have that time together has just been a blessing.
Right, right. So, as we're on this topic of virtual learning and social media just booming with resources for families with autism, I feel like this pandemic has really helped make that even greater because now families at home can't access direct support. So, they might be seeking more virtual advice or even just looking to social media as a resource to them. So, what are maybe some tools that you've found through social media that has helped your family or autism related social media accounts that you enjoy following for guidance?
I love finding families, and especially on Instagram, that are like mine. So ones that share those authentic stories like mine, ones that have reached out even to me and said, my child, this. Oh, I just love following their journey now. Because now we have a connection because you're a mom like me or an educator like me. So even just following, looking at like an Instagram account that you really like and then seeing who follows them and reaching out, and you just keep, the rabbit hole, you keep finding more and more support. And that's the best thing about social media is those support pages, being able to ask questions on support pages. I have found so many cool families and just resources from posting on my own Facebook page, and then families reaching out and saying their story or sharing their story. I just had a parent that must have purchased my book and an additional book, and then they put it in a book library. So families are accessing like book libraries because the libraries were shut down at like a park. And then she had accessed my book and unwrapped and took pictures and sent me like this message saying, I found your book in a book library. And I was like, well, I don't live in Massachusetts. So this had to come from, somebody that purchased the book and thought that it was a need, for their community and put it in there. So just, being able to hear those stories. So reaching out to families that look like mine, that's what I really enjoy.
That had to be such a special moment, and kind of a moment where everything was worth it in the end. All that hard work and putting together the illustrations and the editing, it just had to really come to a full circle for you.
Yes, and it was put into the right hands too. She's like, my book was still wrapped. I wrap every single book and have those stamps of the characters. My kids love helping with the stamps, so we send them out that way. And it was still wrapped. And she has a son with autism, so when she found that book, she had no clue because it was wrapped in brown paper and had little characters on it. So when she opened it, she was like, oh my goodness, like it just spoke to her. And I'm like, how cool is that you decided to pick that book and it was just, meant to speak to you. So
that is really awesome. I'm really curious what your perspective is going to be on this, but I think some people have hesitations when it comes to interacting with individuals with autism, just because there's a lot of different perspectives that are out there, or misconceptions even, that people with autism are always violent or are always antisocial or whatever. It's usually very negative, but we know that is not the case. So what are some important things for our community members, educators, or other professionals to keep in mind when first interacting with individuals with autism?
I would say you can never go wrong with always just being kind. Like, just be kind, be accepting and understanding, and let them lead the way. With my daughter, we, express to other people, like, let her come to you, let her, interact with you the way she wants to interact with you, and then you will see the doors open. My son is completely different, so he's going to right up let you know, like, we're going to have this conversation, I'm going to get to know you, like, we're going to be best friends. So just let them kind of guide the way, and be understanding that that's not every person with autism is going to express the exact same traits or characteristics. So you might have met somebody that was really violent, and it comes down to communication. They were violent not because they are people that want to be violent. There was a reason they became violent. They were frustrated, probably because of lack of communication, lack of being able to express what they wanted to express. There's always a reason for that behavior. So just being kind and being understanding, that just because that one person with autism that acts this way, that does not mean every person with autism is going to act that way. Get to know them and really get to know them.
Yeah, and maybe even take it one step further and try to explore why those behaviors are manifesting. So, behavior
Mhm.
is a form of communication, like you said. And that's something really important for professionals, especially to keep in mind, because day to day, if you're continuously seeing this behavior, it's probably time for you to sit down and try to investigate what is triggering that behavior.
Mhm.
So, that's a good piece of encouragement, to not get down on yourself, and just know that it's going to take some time to figure it out, but you can certainly do it. And just keeping that kindness in mind at the forefront, that if you're trying to be kind, then you're trying to find a solution to some of these problems so that it can
Yeah.
ease up on the child that's experiencing it.
And it's not about you. That's when they're going through those difficult times. It has nothing to do with you. But sometimes as a human, we take it personally. Like, what did I do? What did I make them mad about? It probably wasn't about you, but they're not trying to give you a hard time. They're having a hard time. And we have to realize that when you shift your mind focus of, they're not giving me a hard time, they're having a hard time. What are they having a hard time about? And then getting to the bottom of it, then it's opening the doors of that communication. Like you said, there's a reason for behavior. If you're constantly having those same behavior challenges, you need to do like what I learned in college, the ABCs, the antecedent, behavior, consequence, what happened before, during, after, and start collecting some data to find out. And sometimes it does go back to that science method of that, because if you're having the same exact behavior at the same exact time, and you're doing the same exact consequence or same exact reaction, and you're expecting something different to happen, like, isn't that the definition of insanity? Like, we're doing the same thing expecting something else to happen. So then it has become about you, but they're just having a hard time. You need to figure out the reason for that behavior.
Right, exactly. In our last episode, we spoke a little bit about how, as a parent receiving a diagnosis, you started to pick up on some of the things as a special educator that you did, that you were like, maybe I should start modifying the way that I approach this in delivery of IEP meetings or services. So leading with those strengths. So what advice would you have for new professionals that are entering the education field, or even parents? What advice would you give for either delivering that diagnosis in a more sensitive way, or for the parents who are receiving that autism diagnosis? What advice would you share?
And it's a little different going from parent to professional, but to have the understanding that we're all on the same team and that we all want the same thing. We all want success for your child or your student. And for the parent, sometimes it's hard for us not to be on the defense because we are hearing negative things about our child. They're not doing that to have any sort of ill intentions. So maybe for professionals to be understanding that the parents might be on the defense, and maybe selecting your words carefully and having a positive spin on that, so that when you say a negative thing about their child, they're on the defense of why do you think that, or why do you say that? Sometimes parents, we know deep down, even as a special educator, I knew with my child that there were signs of autism, but I was in that denial phase, and I had to have another professional tell me, like, look at this in a professional standpoint. If you were a special ed teacher observing this child, what would you say? And when I finally got out of that role of, the parent and the just being in denial, I was like, okay. So being understanding that this is a hard process and a hard thing to hear for parents, because it's personal, it's our life, it's what next, and it's so many unknowns. So not just leaving them with that problem, even though given a diagnosis isn't a problem, but we're saying you need to go do X, Y, and Z, having solutions to it. You could, your child could benefit from these programs, and here's how you access that. Here's some numbers to call. Here's how you could get your child involved in some social things or some OT, or those kind of things. Not just the diagnosis process is hard and here are our recommendations, and that's kind of it. And the parents are just so left with the uncertainties of, now what do I do? It's overwhelming. Giving them visuals too, even just phone numbers or pamphlets, so that they can access after those conversations, because those conversations are so hard. Sometimes we walk away going, and they said what? They said a name, I should call this name, and then they get overwhelmed. So going in with some understanding on both ends, as a parent, as a professional, we all want the same thing. How can we work together as a team to accomplish that same goal? But no, this is very personal for the parent. This is their life. This is their children that we're talking about. So be sensitive of how you talk about them, because you should treat them like they're the most important person in that moment, because that's who you're discussing.
Yes, and I think it's really important too for you to mention this idea of parents being on the defense and also the denial piece. So that's not a negative thing for parents to be in
Mm-mm.
denial. And it's, as a professional that handles this every single day, it would be very easy to pass judgment in that moment and get frustrated saying, why won't you just accept what I'm giving to you and go forward so that you can connect with resources. But it does take time to come to terms with different things and to leave expectations in the past and to adjust. So change isn't easy. And so for professionals to have that sensitivity going in and maybe be prepared. So like you said, be sensitive in your delivery and then tell yourself, they might be on the defense, they might question, and not take that personally because it's only coming from a place of love and a place of wanting the best for their own child. So I think that's really important for professionals specifically to keep in mind. So I'm glad you struck upon that.
And what's even more powerful is that of you sharing that story too, is that it doesn't matter what your background is, because I think that experience is going to be shared among everyone, of just feeling that defense and feeling, like you mentioned in our previous episode, a sense of grief. And even though you have experience in the field professionally, you can still feel that yourself as a parent. And I think that can be extremely validating for anyone else to hear, whether they have that background or not, they share that background or not, because what you are experiencing is very real. But as we are starting to wrap up our conversation today, we mentioned quite a few different ways that the community can be actively involved with empowering individuals with autism in the autism community through strategies such as visual supports or just coping mechanisms. So if you could quickly just summarize a few of those strategies for our viewers so that they can take those strategies and use them in their everyday lives, that would be great.
Yeah, and it all comes down to, I always say this, it comes down to starting in the home with your family. So educating your own children, your own family members about autism so that they can then, express their education and keep passing it on and supporting and being understanding. But, when we're looking at concrete things to help, keeping a routine, keeping a structure, a visuals to help with those routines. If there's going to be a routine off and ahead of time on Wednesday, there's going to be a fire drill, preparing them for that, because they need to practice the fire drills just like every other student, not avoiding it, but preparing them for it so that they know when that alarm goes off, we do X, Y, and Z, and it's going to be a disruption in the schedule. Or if you know that the PE is now switched to Friday and there's always PE on Thursday, you just warn them ahead of time, front load them with that information. They'll be accommodating, but they might have to get through it first. They might have to process that on their own terms, their own way, and then they'll understand. But if you just spring it on them, it's not going to be good for you or them. So front load them with that information, provide visuals when appropriate, find their best way of learning. And that's with all students. A lot of these strategies you can use with all students. So find what works for them. Are they auditory, learner? They're a visual learner. My son is both. If he hears something, he's got it. If he hears it one time, he's got it. So fun fact about my child, just because I was thinking of that with the auditory, he is really into country, like top country hits. And we listen to the country station all the time. So he listens to on Pandora, like country hits or something like that. And he can tell you within seconds who the country artist is of every single song. It just loves country. So he listens. So he hears the music. That's how he processes. That's how he learns. So just implementing that into the classroom, but he's also a visual. He likes to have those, visual, and even just the routine of marking them off when he's done or moving them over. If you have a visual schedule, because it makes him feel like sense of accomplishment. He knows we're on the next thing. Same with my daughter. If her routine is off, it's very challenging for her. So getting them that front loaded information of how to make that work, but then also working with what happens when it's going to be different. How can we work through these challenging changes, because things in life aren't always going to be the exact same way. But that doesn't mean in your classroom, well, we're going to have something different every single day, and we're not going to explain that to them, because they need to know in the real world that that's not how it works. No, you go to work, you clock in at the same time, your day usually is pretty the same. And if that is what they need, they would find a job when they're older that does look like that. They would build off their strengths. So but there would be some adjustments, and how do we work through it? So giving them those tools to manage their behavior, giving them some area of calm down, some frequent breaks when you know they're getting overloaded, some fidget toys would say, or brain breaks. I think brain breaks are great. Even just looking at the sensory in your classroom, do you have, some teachers will have like a sensory warmer going. Well, that's a sense now you're activating for that student if that might struggle with sensory overload. Now you're activating their smell. Then if you have the lights, on bright and they're shaking, now you have, their visual. And then if there's music playing, now you're just activating all the senses. So how can you bring them down so that they can focus?
Right. And especially after this year, like we said earlier, everybody can relate to how hard it is when ultimately your entire world and your entire schedule has changed. So the pandemic certainly taught us. And if we all just remember what that felt like when March 13th, 2020,
Yeah.
we realized everyone was told, oh, 2 weeks, everything will be back to normal. Well, then those 2 weeks go by, and all of a sudden we really do need to find and adapt to our schedules. So at this point in time, everybody knows what that feels like. And maybe,
Mhm.
if we had a warning for a month before the pandemic happened, we probably could have prepared for that a little bit. So that's just an example of how valuable that front loading of information can be for a child with autism too. And we can all relate to it now. So
Mhm.
there's no excuse for not wanting to acknowledge that, because we really have all lived it as well. So, last question for you today before we wrap up. What are some ways that you encourage self care for your students, your children, or for yourself? Because we know that being a parent alone can be very overwhelming. And we're just very curious to see what you do for yourself and how you help yourself reset each week so that you
Mhm.
can remain that optimistic self that you are.
Yeah, so communication between my husband and I, we know if we don't work, we all don't work. We have to be on the same page. So just giving us that time on Sundays to go over the schedule for the week, be on the same page so that we're not like, no, did you do this or did I do this? Communication is key for us. But Mondays is our date night. So we implemented a once a week date night. And actually, this was my brother's idea. So my brother and his fiance, they don't have any children. And they noticed at like a Christmas that we were completely overwhelmed and we were like hands on deck all the time, and we didn't get to sit and socialize. There was just more needs for our children that we had to accommodate than my siblings and their children that are kind of efficient, and they're sitting there hanging out and all talking, and I'm chasing this one and making sure that one doesn't touch the fireplace and making sure that that door is locked because they'll get into the toilet, and like doing all these things that parents just do, and had fight or flight mode all the time. And he reached out to us after that and said, it just seems like you need some time, or maybe just a couple hours, like once a week, to just chill, maybe go to dinner, have somebody else make it instead of you. You and Steele can just talk, because you can't talk with that going on. You can't tell me that's you actually have time to discuss things and just be able to do whatever you want to do. So at first my husband and I were like, okay, so what do we do? You know what I mean? Like, we have a couple hours for ourselves. We didn't even know, that was so foreign to us. Like, what do we do? So we implemented the date night. So he has been coming over and watching the kids give us a couple hours. And he's been doing this for about 2 years now, just never missed a day. He loves, coming over and hanging out with my children. And like he said, this gives me an opportunity to really get to know my son and daughter. Um, so anyways, I do that on Mondays. We have that date night. And then throughout the week, I just trying to spend time to read. I love reading, and I want to get back to reading or writing, and just spending a couple time, an hour to ourselves, and making sure my husband and I on that same page. Like today, he went and hit golf balls. That's his stress relief. Go hit golf balls. We make sure we always have time to do something like active or physical. So I like to ride my Peloton, and he has a gym in the garage, and he goes out and works out there, giving us our time. But then also making sure we have family time on the weekends. And my children too, they want that social. They want to get out. They love being outside. So we live next to a park, and giving them that time to just no responsibilities, nobody telling them what to do or asking them to do a task, and just be able to run around and be a kid.
Yes, well, that's some great advice for anyone watching who might be feeling overwhelmed, and some ideas for them to relieve their stress or to decompress, and then, to implement that in your schedule every week so that you don't get to a breaking point and feel so overwhelmed to the capacity that you can't go further anymore. So thank you for
Mhm.
sharing that. And Kayla, thank you so much for spending all the time that you have with us, sharing your story, sharing all of your experiences with us. We absolutely think that your episode will resonate with so many of our viewers, and we're so thankful that you spent some time with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So if you enjoyed this episode and would like to learn more about Kayla's projects, please make sure to visit her website at raysofsteel.com, and Rays is spelled REAS, Steel STEELE. You can also follow her on Instagram at Rays of Steel Autism and on Facebook at Autism Inspired Resources. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next Sunday.
Thank you for listening to Spectrum Sundays. We are your hosts, Miss Thousand Islands, Francesca D'Alessandro,
and Miss Central Pennsylvania, Megan Sinisi. Please make sure to subscribe to our series and follow us on social media to stay connected with autism professionals and self-advocates.
And remember, true impact is accomplished through active listening and exploring the world through a variety of perspectives.
Join us next week on Spectrum Sundays to help cultivate a community of inclusion, appreciation, and acceptance around autism.